Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this part two of a two-part series, a presentation on teen anxiety and resilience. Please understand that although I'm addressing this to teens, this material does apply very much so to elementary with cycle 3 students. And so for those who didn't have the opportunity to watch part one, I invite you to go and take a look on my website. I will show you afterwards where to find the link, but there's a place where you can find the recording. And so today we're doing part two. This was a request from Eastern Township School Board to try to take it one step further and to look at more specific clientele. So basically the kind of sections that we're going to cover today is just doing a quick summary of an overview of the part one that I did last year. And then we're going to look at neurodiversity clientele and anxiety. We're going to look at trauma complex clientele and anxiety. Then we're going to move into practices, because I always like to tie in not just the theory, but look at also, the day-to-day practices and so forth, starting with which ones to avoid and why. Oops, sorry. And the last part, we're going to focus on those neurodiversity affirming practices and trauma-informed practices. And so those are the different sections that we'll be doing. Please know that at the end of this presentation, I will be putting in the chat the PowerPoint, so you'll have access to it. And I'm going to, the slides, and I'm going to send them to Nicole so she can email them to all of you as well. And so if ever you don't get an email from her with those slides, just let her know, and in this way she'll be able to forward them. So the reason why I didn't give you the slides today is just because I want you to sit back and take this in. No need to take notes. You'll see there's tons and tons of information already on the slides. So in terms of part one, basically what I talked about last year was understanding, where does anxiety come from? What is that about? I mean, it's a term that we hear all the time. The student's anxious, I'm feeling anxious. They have a diagnosis of generalized anxiety disorder and so forth. And so I really kind of wanted, through this first part presentation, to normalize this phenomenon, for us to understand that anxiety, the root of anxiety, is what we call alarm. And alarm is a very primal instinct-based emotion. It is something that we all have in our system. It is a very needed emotion, and it is there for survival purposes, because if we were never alarmed by a dangerous situation, then we would not have the reflexes to move to caution. And so this emotion is there for good reason. There is a purpose to that. And so the difference between alarm and anxiety is alarm is the foundational emotion. It's the instinct that we all have as a response to threat and danger. Anxiety is basically alarm, but one step further into the defenses. And so, and I talk a bit more about that in part one. I won't have the opportunity now to kind of really dig deeper, but just understand that anxiety, contrary to alarm, is more of a vague sense of unsafety and unease. And it's characterized with apprehension and restlessness. So we have all of the bodily reactions, but we're not sure why it is that we're reacting that way. And so we may wake up in the morning feeling off, feeling that, something is just aching at us, and not able to put our finger on it, not able to make sense of why is it that I'm feeling this way. And so our students and ourselves, even, I mean, this applies to all, human beings, this idea that the continuum from knowing the threat and being able to speak of what alarms you and what you're afraid of, to, as there are more defenses and more numbing out of certain emotions and the way that we see things, that we're not able to put our finger on it. And so I talked about in the first part of the presentation the typical developmental stages for adolescence. And this really does start, in the third cycle of elementary, where students are at that place of moving towards the adolescent phase. And things are really shifting on so many levels. And part of it is that the student is discovering their sense of self, who they are, what's part of them. And there's so many different parts that make who they are. But at the same time, this brings up a lot of feelings where they're self-concerned. They're very egocentric at that age, self-involved about what's happening to them and how things impact and affect them. They're also quite self-conscious, where it doesn't take much for them to feel shame, to feel uncomfortable. I remember when my daughter first moved into the adolescent phase, she was at that point during that time that she no longer wanted to be seen in public with mom and dad, because that was too embarrassing for her to be seen with mom and dad and to look babyish. And so you see the self-consciousness, maybe with a certain physical appearance. We know that at adolescence, there's a lot of acne, and as you know, many kids have braces and so forth. And so there's a lot of self-consciousness that comes with that. And, it's difficult for them at that age to make room for all the different parts of themselves. And so there may be certain parts that they're embarrassed of, or that they don't want to share, or that they're afraid that they're going to get rejected because of that. And so it brings up all of these different feelings, and those feelings can, of course, lead to alarm, but could potentially lead eventually with accumulation to anxiety. Now, the other thing that I spoke about is how attachment, which is our biggest need, can also be our biggest threat. And Gordon Neufeld, who's a developmental psychologist, and I know many of you at ETSB know the Neufeld material because it is so ingrained at your board. But Gordon Neufeld created this theory on attachment, which is different from the one from Bowlby. Bowlby talks about how attachment is either secure or insecure or ambivalent in between. And so Gordon Neufeld really kind of lays out the theory of attachment in a more complex way. And for us to understand that there's more fluidity in attachment than just being secure and insecure. And there's different levels at which people attach at. And so the first level is through physical proximity. The second level is through having something in common. The third level is through a sense of belonging and loyalty. The fourth level is through a sense of significance and feeling important to others. The fifth one is through a sense of emotional intimacy. And the last one is in terms of psychological intimacy. And so, as I mentioned, there can be a threat to each of these different levels. And so if at the level of being with, students feel isolated or feel rejected and so forth, this would be part of the threat in that attachment route. If they feel different, and so going back to being afraid of sharing different parts of them because they feel that they are not fitting in and that they are different. And today we're going to be talking about neurodiversity and talking about complex trauma. And so this is a huge element here where students may feel quite threatened in their differences, in terms of feeling like they don't belong. And so that too, for that clientele, if we're applying neurotypical practices in a classroom, and the student who is neurodiverse or has complex trauma is seeing that other students are functioning and doing well and they're not, then not only do they feel different, but they also may feel that they don't belong, that things haven't been set up for them in mind, feeling that they don't matter to others, feeling that they're not cared for, and feeling like they are misunderstood or not known. And so this could be all many different ways in the system on a day-to-day basis where students can have an alarm above and beyond the typical alarm that adolescence has in development. And so all of that kind of compounds on each other. And so I talked before about the importance at that age of adolescence to fit in. And it is typical during adolescence to go through this phase of trying to develop your sense of self and becoming your own, becoming independent, becoming unique, having a sense of individuation. But at the same time, there's such a dichotomy between trying to become your own person and yet still for attachment purposes to continue to conform and to fit in, because there's this fear that if you don't fit in and conform, that this will be a threat to the attachment root of being different and of belonging. And so this is quite typical at that age. And then add on to that performance anxiety, where, whether it's in sports or it's in academics, where, students trying to win all the time and has a hard time with failure and mistakes and so forth. This is yet again an added stress. So to conclude for the first section, in part one of the presentation that I did last year, not only did I walk through what anxiety and alarm is, and that kind of explained how does that play out at adolescence, I also gave an introduction to how to address it. And so I won't walk through it just yet too much, because I will be doing this in the last part of this presentation. But I did want to say that we spoke about resilience and understanding that resilience, and this is a concept that is more and more popular now in psychology and so forth. There's a lot of research being done on resilience. However, not all research is done equal. And sometimes the way that resilience has been defined is that the student or the individual is just coping. It's a coping skill, that they are strong. And yes, there's a sense of strength and courage that is part of it. But please understand that resilience can actually be quite difficult to go through and to build. And so the idea is not that you don't have a hard time going through it. It's not that it is easy. It's not that you don't have grief. It's not that you don't have sadness. It's not that you don't have frustration. It's not the first part. What's important to understand is that regardless of this adversity that is happening with the situation at hand, that you're able to bounce back from that. And so even though it was difficult, that you were able to recognize after you've gone through it, oh my goodness, I survived it. I was able to get on the other side of that situation. And so the three keys that are necessary to build resilience is a sense of safety. And this happens in relationships. So it's not just that we're saying to the student or the child or the adolescent, feel safe. We need to set up the parameters. This is done through relationships. And so to be able to set up that sense of safety. The second key is looking at expression. For those who've heard me speak many times, I've spoke of the importance of emotions and letting emotions run their course, and to have mediums to express your emotions. And I think that at the elementary level, this is very intuitive, but at the high school level, how often I see things shift, and how school staff now have this assumption that because the student is older, that they are more mature and more capable on their own. And understanding that with certain clienteles, whether it is the neurodiverse population or a child with complex trauma, oftentimes these students are still quite immature and need a certain structure and accompaniment similar to what we were doing at the elementary. And so this emotional expression, although the medium might be more age appropriate to teens, it is still the same process of accompaniment and doing it with them. And so we'll be walking through these three keys later. But first, I kind of want to walk through the neurodivergent population, and then I'm going to walk through the complex trauma population and kind of unfolding that a little bit so we can understand where to go if we know where we're at. So the next part of this presentation will look at neurodiversity and anxiety. Now, before I talk about the anxiety portion, I really want to define what do we mean by neurodiversity. And so the dictionary definition of neurodiversity is individual differences in brain functioning regarded as normal variations within the human population. And so it's not considered a disorder, but there are how can I say this? There's a range of differences in the way that the brain works. And so if you've got a neurotypical individual, the brain will work in a certain way. And then there's a continuum of hypersensitivity and neurodiversity to those who have the most challenges. And so it really is a continuum. The concept that differences in brain functioning with the human population are normal, and that brain functioning that is not neurotypical should not be stigmatized. And the other definition of neurodiversity is the inclusion in a group, organization, etc., of people with different types of brain functioning. And so understanding that when we're offering a neurodiverse practice in the classroom, we're trying to be inclusive to all students and keeping them in mind in terms of communication, keeping things in mind in terms of the way we teach information and so forth. And I'll walk that through. But in terms of the population that fits under the umbrella of neurodiversity and sensitivity are, for example, autism spectrum disorder. Giftedness fits into that because of the heightened emotions, yes, the intellect that's heightened, but also the emotions and the sensory. ADHD fits into this. Tourette syndrome and fatal alcohol spectrum fits into that as well. And so some of the characteristics that we might see is that they're highly reactive, that they may be introvert, that they've got developmental differences, that they have an autonomic system that is quite reactive and responds quickly to stress, that they have issues with executive functioning, they're hypersensitive, they're overstimulated easily. They have sensory processing issues. They have issues with attention. They get dysregulated easily with their emotions and so forth. And shyness fits into that as well. And so you really see all of that continuum. Oh, and the last piece, sorry, I missed it down here, was issues related to traumatic brain injury. And so it's not just individuals that are born with different differences. It could happen, for example, with the fatal alcohol spectrum, where it's something that happened during the developmental of the child within the pregnancy, and of course, if there was some sort of accident. And so one of the parts that I wanted to kind of focus on, just to kind of show you in terms of the diversity between a neurotypical and a neurodivergent individual, is how the sensory gating system works. And so what the sensory gating system is basically a filter that we have at the stem of our brain. I'll show you this image for a second and I'll go back. And so the way that our brain works is from the stem, where we take in our world, we take in through our senses, through the five senses, the interoception, and there's I think there is 7 or 8 now different senses. And so our brain through the stem will take in the sensory, and then it will work itself through from the back of the brain to the front. And the front is the more sophisticated part of the brain, where you've got reasoning and executive functioning. And so if we go back to, and here's the sensory gating system. I mean, it's a picture, right? It's just to give you a visual of what we're talking about. But so for the individuals who are neurodivergent, that filter there doesn't work as well as the sensory gating system for a neurotypical individual. And so for a neurotypical individual, they have what happens is that they're able to kind of cut out the noise. They're able to filter the outside stimuli that is not relevant to what they need in the moment. And so think about yourself where you're sitting outside, in a park, for example, and there's, kids playing, and there's dogs barking and all sorts of, movement, and there's, sounds, and there's smells, and there's so many different things. And we're trying to read a book. And so we are able, if we've got a good, well-functioning sensory gating system, to cut out those smells and those noises and the things that we see in front of us, to be able to focus on reading the book. The thing with a neurodivergent individual is that their sensory gating system is perforated I'm saying this as an analogy, is perforated and doesn't work as well. And so they have a hard time filtering out the noise. I'll never forget, about I would say about 10 years ago, I participated at a presentation that a colleague gave on autism and what it's like to live a day in an autistic child's shoes. And she had found a way with the video camera to play with the sounds and with the lighting. And she had filmed a moment in a Walmart. And it was just so, what's the word? It was just so, not life-changing, but it really kind of highlighted, oh my goodness, the world that these kids go through, and the impact that it has with the overbearing light, with the overbearing sounds, with the overbearing movements and smells and so forth. And so all of that really does play a role. And so for that student who's trying to focus on their work in the classroom, and that Johnny next to them is tapping the pencil on the desk, or that Mary on the other side is crumpling up paper, it makes it really difficult for those students to be able to focus. And so it has an impact on not just their capacity to focus, but also in terms of regulating their emotions. Now, we know now through research that neurodivergent individuals are more easily affected and moved by their emotions. Their amygdala, that is in their limbic system, that's the emotional part of the brain, gets triggered very easily and kind of goes to 0 to 100 very fast. And for not many not just for dangerous situations, it happens in like even everyday situations. They get more easily overwhelmed by that emotional experience, not just because there's a lot of it, but because it is very intense. And because of that, they're more likely to be stuck emotionally, to numb out their emotions, to try to intellectualize that experience instead of letting emotions run their course. And oftentimes these are kids who have a hard time finding their tears, and because of that, they have also a hard time adapting to new situations. The other piece that is at play here is that oftentimes the adult's reaction to that very intense student is to attempt prematurely to bring them to a state of calm. And we think that we're doing that to help them. But you'll see as we walk through this presentation that it actually doesn't help the situation to focus prematurely on bringing them to a state of calm. There is a benefit to the body in terms of functioning and well-being to let out those emotions and to let them run their course. Now, some of the differences in the neurodivergent population is not just about the sensory gating system, but there's also differences in terms of sensory, the way that their sensory world is taken in. There are differences in communication where some of them may be non-speaking, or they may need a device to help them with their speech, or that they have different multimodal ways of communicating, whether it's through gestures or icons and not just words. And echolalia is also very common in some populations of the neurodivergent individuals, where they're repeating the language that has been heard previously. There's also differences in motor, whether it is gross motor differences in terms of the way they walk, their muscle tone, their balance, coordination, and so forth. There are fine motor differences in terms of being able to handle different objects, or apraxia, where they have an involuntary movements and they cannot control those. They also have differences in executive functioning, where certain of the fruit of executive functioning aren't working as well. So they have a hard time with planning, with preparing things, organization, time management, problem solving, focus and attention, self-regulation, and remembering steps to do a task. And so these things can be quite challenging for them, whether it's, for example, to organize their desk, or to turn in finished work, or to even participate in class and give an answer to a question a teacher may ask. In terms of the way that they play or their interests, oftentimes neurodivergent individuals may have specific or deep interests and have those in a loop. And those will come out in the way that they will play. In terms of emotions and empathy, it's not that they don't have empathy for others. It's been shown that actually neurodivergent individuals are very empathetic, but very empathetic to the nonverbal and the emotion itself. Where they have struggles is to be able to identify and to describe those emotions. So they're not able to speak about how another person is feeling or behaving, but their body senses all of that energy. And another thing that is quite typical in the neurodivergent population, due to all of these different stresses that they have in their body, is to stim. And so stimming is a repetitive action or movement in the body, including making noises to help with self-regulation, expression, or maybe even simply for enjoyment. And so Again, I mentioned before that sometimes adults will try to attempt to calm the individual. And so stimming might be an example where if the adult doesn't understand the purpose of stimming, may try to prematurely cut that out. And so due to all these differences and these different stressors in their life, it's been shown with statistics that there's a much higher rate of anxiety in autistic individuals and other neurodiverse populations, with up to 84% that are experiencing not just some alarm, but that are experiencing anxiety that is impairing their functioning. And so if we can look at trying to make sense of this population and try to tailor the supports for them to be more successful, this will help minimize some of that anxiety in them. And so part of these examples that trigger them in school is not just the sensory experience that can be overwhelming, but it's also sometimes the disruptions that may happen in the routines that they're used to doing that are predictable for them. And so if there's a disruption in that, this can be actually quite destabilizing for them. Perhaps there may be expectations for certain behaviors that they are not able to do given some of their differences and challenges. The stress may come from overwhelming demands and expectations that are not adapted to their capacity. It might be that there are certain situations that come up, whether in the classroom or in the playground, that are violating their internal rules and that are making sense of the world. That they are imposing changes with the child who's unprepared for those changes, that may be waiting too long or may be hurried too fast, witnessing or experiencing social injustice. That might be a certain trigger because they don't understand the nuances of that, and they're all in their emotions. They might have fears about making mistakes or not achieving perfection in certain tasks and so forth, and so that might put a lot of pressure, this is typical of adolescence, but yet it adds another layer when we're talking about neurodiverse populations. And the last one is the fear of peer criticism or being labeled as stupid. And so all of that in a school setting and more, right? I mean, these are just some examples that can add on to the nervous system of an individual and can have an impact on anxiety. And so I mentioned stimming before, and so understanding the self-stimulatory behavior, which is a repetitive action or movement of the body. And so here are examples of stimming. And so twirling the hair, for example, biting nails, rocking back and forth, flapping the hands, flickering the finger, or repetitive movements with the finger, the arching or tensing parts of the body, visual stimming, where there's really a hyper focus on something that is there, watching something intensely or on repeat, chewing or mouthing items, spinning or twirling, repeating behaviors like opening and closing a container, and etc. Now, please understand that stimming is the word that we're giving this, but even neurotypical individuals oftentimes have different behaviors to manage stress. How often I catch myself sometimes playing with my watch, or I'm twirling my ring when I have it, or I might be doing something with my hands, and it's not as noticeable. And so the thing with stimming is that for some students, it might be actually very noticeable to the point where it's disturbing and distracting in the classroom. And so oftentimes the reflex of the adult is to try to cut that out or to be able to minimize it and contain it. But we do need to understand that stimming has a purpose. It's there for a reason. And so first purpose is self-regulation, where it helps to distract from the dampened sensory input of outside sources. It helps to enhance or provide additional sensory input if needed, because you've got the hypersensitive individual, but you also have the hyposensitive individual that needs additional sensory because the sensory is not affecting them as much. It may help them to manage their emotions or sensations. It may bring them to a state of calm. It may help them handle stress or overwhelming situations. Stimming can also have a purpose of expression. It is a form of expression to release strong feelings or reactions. to communicate frustration or fear or overwhelm. And it can also communicate joy, excitement, happiness, etc. And of course, it can be done simply for enjoyment. You know, how often when we get excited about something, we may have a reaction of a yes or a dance or something. And so it's the same thing with them. But again, given their neurological differences, they don't always pick up on the social cues. And so sometimes their timing might be off, or sometimes the way they do it might be over the top, and then it becomes a distraction to the rest of the students in the classroom. But we do the same things. It's just that we do it more subtly. And so stimming should be honored and left to be completed unless it is harming the individual or others. And so how can we try to find a place and a time for stimming to occur? Now, masking is another concept that is really important for me to discuss. And so what is masking? When a neurodivergent person works to suppress or hide their natural qualities or differences, this is called masking. It can occur in a variety of settings or for many different reasons, whether consciously or unconsciously. Reasons for masking may include fitting in or trying to uphold social norms in order to feel a sense of belonging. It may be to keep oneself safe from bullying, judgment, or stigma. It may be for performing at school or a certain activity. It may be to try to make friends or to keep friends. Because not meaning to mask, but doing so as of a learned habit. And so many children, if they've had rigid households with high expectations, it has become the default to mask in order to fit in. And so some examples of masking could be trying to withstand sensory discomfort when in front of others, minimizing or hiding stimming in front of others, mirroring or mimicking the facial expressions or gestures of others because we think that that's what is the norm and what's appropriate. Forcing oneself to give eye contact. And so we know how many students have a hard time with having the eyes in the eyes, how overwhelming that is. And so we also need to be sensitive to them, to not force them to look at us in the eyes, downplaying or avoiding personal interest, and etc. And so again, masking happens because of the neurotypical environment being the norm, and how there is a lack of inclusion. And so for the child to want to be included, will mask in order to fit in. The problem with masking is that it can be extremely stressful, exhausting, and it creates dysregulation and burnout in those populations. Studies have shown that masking can lead to some extremely negative outcomes, including higher rates of depression and suicidal ideation. And so I put here two links of studies that spoke of this. As educators and allies, we can support their mental health by not teaching social skills that promote masking. So for example, forcing eye contact, embracing and supporting individual students' interests and differences, openly talking to students about neurodiversity and promoting an environment of acceptance, and encouraging self-advocacy by helping students recognize their individual needs and strengths. So now we're going to walk into the section of trauma and anxiety. And so what is trauma? Trauma literally means a wound, an injury, or a shock. Trauma is one possible outcome of exposure to adversity. Trauma occurs when a person perceives an event or a set of circumstances as extremely frightening, harmful, or threatening, either emotionally, physically, or both. And there's different types of trauma. You could have what we call the big traumas, which are the ACEs, and we'll talk about that in a second. And there can also be very hurtful experiences, what we call the smaller traumas, that can lead to long-lasting marks, such as bullying, such as repeated harsh comments from loved ones, chronic distress experienced by a hypersensitive individual. And so for those that are interested in reading about trauma, Gabor Mate wrote this book called The Myth of Normal, which is a terrific book. I strongly encourage you to take a look at it. And in his book, he mentions that trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside of you following that situation. And so, of course, when we're talking about big traumas, the ACEs, which is the adverse childhood experiences, then those, of course, potentially lead more strongly to a trauma, whether it's physical abuse, emotional abuse, physical neglect, sexual abuse, emotional neglect, substance use in the household, mental illness in the household, and divorce, where there is a lot of high conflict, a relative who's been incarcerated, and the mother who has been treated violently. And so all of these different things, especially if they're happening chronically and they're happening at a young age, this can lead to trauma. Now, please understand that it is normal for the nervous system to go in and out of sympathetic and parasympathetic processes. And so I mentioned before and I don't know if I have a slide of this. I'm just going to go and see if I have one. Oh, I didn't even put one in my presentation. Sorry about that. I typically put a slide on the brain, and the one on the brain, I show kind of the limbic system and the amygdala. And so I explain that the way that it's orchestrated in the brain when there's an adverse situation at hand is the amygdala will send a signal to the hypothalamus, and the hypothalamus will orchestrate the body through cortisol and through all of the different hormones, the endocrine system, in order to activate itself for safety. So when we're talking about fight, flight, freeze response, this is the endocrine system that is at work. And so it's normal for us to come in and out of a state of flight, fight, freeze to a state of calm and back and forth, depending on different situations. But for an individual who has gone through trauma, then sometimes what can happen is that the brain will stay stuck in sympathetic or parasympathetic mode, where they will be hyper aroused or they will be hypo aroused. And we'll talk about that in a second. And so I mentioned before that if trauma happened chronically, but especially at a young age, that can have a great impact on complex trauma. And so this picture here is the difference between, on the right-hand side, an individual who started off their life in an orphanage and had severe neglect, to an individual on the left-hand side who's had a happy, healthy household. And so you see the differences. And by the way, the imagery that you see is done with a machine where we're able to check out the activation in different parts of the brain. And so if the brain has been activated, is in parasympathetic mode, then if the child is healthy, all of these different parts will be activated. And so not just the limbic system will be activated, also the prefrontal cortex, to be able to slow down and filter the impulsivity. But you can see for that individual who's gone through chronic long-term trauma, that there's even portions of the brain that are not activated. And so there is not much happening in the prefrontal cortex and in the temporal lobes, which help with filtering and tempering those impulsivities. And so oftentimes for those individuals, it is no filter types of reaction, and the amygdala is so hypersensitive that it kind of kicks off at not much. And I'll show us a slide in a minute that will show you kind of the difference. So the double invisible handicap for individuals with complex trauma, or not only is the amygdala easily reactive to a situation at hand, even if it's not a dangerous situation, they also have a prefrontal cortex and corpus callosum that is compromised. And so you see it here, the lack here of activation. And so because that area is compromised, they don't have the ability to regulate those emotions. So not only are they hyper reactive, they have nothing to filter it. And so there's a double invisible handicap for this population. And so for them, they can't be in their integrative brain or focus on cognitive capacity. They are all in their emotions and instincts in survival mode and trying to avoid danger. And so if we were to see it this way, this is a chart that shows a neurotypical individual in the middle versus a sensitized. And when we say sensitized, it could be not just complex trauma, but also neurodiverse individuals, to an individual who has worked on building their resiliency here at the bottom. So if we go with the chart from the left to the right, On the left here, we're starting at daily challenges, to moving towards more moderate stress, to moving towards a more distressful, threatening situation. So there's a degree and increment in level of stress from the left to the right. From the bottom to the top, we are looking at the state of emotions of that individual, where they start off at the bottom with a state of calm, to moving to a state of alertness, to a state of alarm, to a state of fear, to a state of terror. And so we see with the neurotypical individual how those reactions are proportionate to the situation at hand. So in a daily challenge, they're remaining in the calm and alert phases. It's only when stress starts becoming moderate to now they're starting to move into more of the alarm. And of course, and this is typical and expected, if they're in a situation of distress and threat, of course they're going to be in a state of terror or fear. In comparison, if we look at the sensitized individual, we can see how quickly, just in daily challenges, how quickly it jumps from a state of calm to a state of fear to even almost at a state of terror. And it doesn't take much. And so this is the proof here of the amygdala being kindled. And so the amygdala kicks off really quickly at just typical daily challenges. And then once we're at just moderate stress, they're already terrorized. And then you see that then it cuts off, it kind of, the curve continues there because it is similar for them, whether it's a threatening, distressful situation, than just moderate stress. And so the idea here is not to get them to not feel those emotions. We can't cut out emotions. That's not the way that our bodies work. We need to honor those emotions and make room for them. Remember when I talked about the triangle of resiliency, I spoke about sense of safety as number one. I spoke about emotional expression and then helping to build their sense of strength. And so those are the three. And so this is what we would be working on when we're trying to build their resilience. And so the more that we can help those individuals build a strong, resilient capacity, the more they will be able to tolerate stress in daily challenges and moderate stress situations. And so this is the way in to be able to support these populations. Oh, and I forgot to mention, and this is as for complex cases situation, we really need to understand each student individually. And so, and to figure out where is their, what we call their window of tolerance. So for some individuals, there are things that will spark their stress. But, and then if you add on the daily stresses, then they will get dysregulated and become hyper aroused. But it could also happen that they can, from dysregulation, not just be hyper aroused, but become hypo aroused. And so instead of being overwhelmed and anxious and out of control, they will be numbed out and frozen and disconnected. And so the two outcomes are possible. And so what we want to do is, as we get to know that student, try to find out where is that happy medium for them, where they're able to tolerate their environment enough to be functional and to not move into dysregulation and hyper or hypo arousal. And so there's examples here of different things, but I'm going to show you in two sections from now, more concrete practices that we can do to help support those students. But before we get into what we can do, I first want to talk about those practices that we need to avoid and why. And so the first element to avoid is trying to approach behavior through the behavioral lens and trying to project intentionality in the student's behavior, thinking that they're doing this on purpose, trying to focus on just the appropriateness of the behavior and making the student feel bad because they're inappropriate, and believing that rewards and consequences are the answer. And so projecting intentionality in the behavior obscures the true nature and purpose of emotions. Emotions is what pushes a behavior. A behavior is not something that we choose. We don't do this on purpose. There's no intention behind a behavior. A behavior is pushed by our instincts and emotions. And so once we understand that, then it's about helping to support those emotional situations. And if we're able to help the student temper themselves, this will answer to the behavior. And so that's the first part. Focusing on the appropriateness of the behavior can endanger the unfolding of the elements necessary for there to become mature and civilized behavior. Because if the child or the adolescent or the teen, the student, excuse me, feels shame and guilt given that their behavior is not appropriate, this will just cause more defense, and it will bring them into a state of numbness, and then there is nothing to work with to get them to build that resiliency and to grow up and mature. And rewards and consequences might work for the wrong reasons short term, but it actually undermines intrinsic motivation and good intention for deep, long-lasting change. And so we have these, and they're still very much present in our school setting, these behavior management systems, whether it's through consequences and rewards, whether it's through sending the student to principal's office or to suspend them, put them in detention, having reflection rooms, having them sign a contract, having zero tolerance discipline measures. The problem with this approach, with this clientele, is that not only does it not help change or improve their behavior, it actually exacerbates the situation and makes them more stressful, makes them more what's the word, shameful and guilty, and it just compounds things and makes it worse. The problem with compliance-based strategies is that, especially for that more vulnerable population, the one that have a hard time making nuances and deciphering different situations, we are actually setting a precedent for that vulnerable population, where we're saying to them, or they're coming to the understanding that I have to do what you say, regardless of how I feel about it. And this puts neurodivergent individuals into a position of being at risk for future abuse. And so they're not able to understand that we are trying to get them to comply for their benefit. And they're not able to distinguish when adults are trying to coerce them into doing something, whether they're doing it for the right or the wrong reasons, because it's abusive. And so we need to be careful that we don't set a precedent for those students and set them up for dangerous potential situations at risk with predators. Also, compliance-based strategies often ask a student to mask or to adhere to their neurotypical norms. And so masking can be, as I mentioned before, can be detrimental to their mental health and physical health. Compliance-based strategies do not validate the internal feelings or the needs that neurodiverse individuals have. It also overlooks critical development areas such as self-awareness and self-advocacy. And so how can we help them build a rapport with themselves and help them build that resiliency that will lead to more tempered emotion, and that will lead eventually to more mature behavior? And so the other issue too is that for the adult, when the natural influence is lacking, because the student is not attached to us or not attuned or receptive to our attachment in the moment, it may happen that the adults expect the student to listen anyway because of their role. Now, please understand that it's not because you're a teacher, that you're a tech, that you're an attendant, that you're a principal, that the student should listen to you because of your role. We're not built this way. It is because of who we are to that individual that they will want to listen to us. And so it's about building that relationship. It's about getting them to attach to us and to be engaged in the relationship in the moment when we're trying to ask them to do something. We tend to assume that the problem when we don't have that natural influence is the lack of knowledge and know-how on the part of the adult. And it's not a question of the practices you use. And yes, of course, it's part of it. But the more important piece is who you are to that individual, to that child, to that student, to that teen. It is about the relationship. Now, the unfortunate part is that when the adult is feeling discouraged or powerless or frustrated, or that situation is out of hand, sometimes adults will give up their natural nurturing responsibilities and will become more reactive, or they will tend to seek on leverage or on forcefulness to resort to compliance. And so it is important for us to keep ourselves in check, and that when we are frustrated, let's work as a team and to be able to have a colleague that can help out in the situation. Because if we don't, then the vicious circle here is that if, due to the student's immaturity, hypersensitivity, defensiveness, or intensive emotions, this leads to behavior that can be alienating. But if the adults focus only on that behavior and don't understand what's at the base of it, and don't have tolerance for this behavior, and are upset and use a discipline that is more traditional in that sense, then this will just create a continuation of a vicious circle, because this will cause more emotion, more defendedness, more behavior, and then it will just continue in that loop. The other piece that we need to be careful about, just want to make sure we're counting the time, that we need to be careful about is focusing just on the cerebral approach, on reason, focusing on the irrationality of the behavior, focusing on the intellectual or the cognition of the behind the behavior, or that we're focusing on just thinking, trying to get them to think right. Those three can be an issue. And so focusing on irrationality of the behavior conceals the true purpose of emotions. Although the behavior may seem irrational, the brain has its reasons for functioning in a such way, and it can be because of survival purposes or as a stress response. And so even if it doesn't make sense to us, there has to be a reason behind that, and it's important for us to honor it and to make space for that. And I'm not saying that we should let the child, especially if they're out of control and that it becomes a dangerous situation for others. I'm not saying that we should let them do it. What I'm saying is, can we find pockets of time where they can have a time and space and the invitation to be able to let out what's within them? Focusing on cognition as a priority negates the underlying needs that are communicated by the emotion, and focusing on thinking blinds to the feelings that are involved. And so understanding how mixed feelings work. I'll just give you an example to kind of illustrate what I mean by mixed feelings. And so when a student is frustrated, they may have the impulse to attack. And so in order for them to have a more civilized behavior, the way through is not about cutting out the impulse to attack. It's about helping them find their patience. And so patience is not that we're not frustrated. Patience is that regardless of the frustration, because we care about the other person we're frustrated with, we will not want to act on the impulse to attack because we don't want to hurt that person, or because we don't want to get in trouble, because we care about being a good student, or we care about following rules, that we're not going to do it to not get in trouble. And so it's the combination, it's the mixing of the two emotions that allow for patience. And this is what needs to happen in order to temper the attack. It's not about cutting out the attack. And this is something that comes with time. It's not something that happens overnight. This requires coaching from our part. And so what doesn't work as well is when we're focusing on trying to reason with the student, we're talking too much, especially when we're focusing on consequences, both for neurodivergent populations and for complex trauma cases. When we talk too much, we are keeping them in high arousal. We are keeping them in flight, fight, or freeze mode, because remember that given that they're so sensitive with their environment and that they have a hard time filtering out the noise, when we are too much with verbal interventions, this actually can make the situation worse by dysregulating the child further. And so when the child is in survival mode, on top of it, they cannot even hear the words we're saying. Their body is so much in hypervigilance that they're focused on our body language and our tone. They're not able to process the words we're using, our language. And so it's so important, especially when the student is upset, that we minimize the language, that we use our bodies to guide, nonverbals, using visuals, using the structure and routines. All of that is important to consider rather than talking too much. And of course, as we're talking, the student is trying to pick up in our tone or body language if we are going to say to them, I've had it with you. Remember that attachment is our biggest preeminent need. And so if they feel threatened in that relationship, this will take precedent over what they've done wrong and how to make it better. Now, in terms of letting emotions run their course, understanding that if a student is frustrated and upset, if we let it run its course and that the frustration is released, on the other side, they will come back to a state of calm. But if we work at it backwards and that we focus on the reasoning approach, trying to impose right thinking on the student, making them focus on being positive, making them focus on pursuing happiness or resisting the motion of that frustration or fear of whatever that is, and pursuing calmness and tranquility at all cost, we're going at it backwards. We're going against the nature of how emotions work. And so if we let emotions run their course, then if the student then can adapt to that situation and find their tears, then this will soften their behavior, their reaction, their emotions, and then they will come out in a state of calm. And so the third piece to address as well is trying to teach self-regulation prematurely and believing that self-regulation is something that you build through skills and teaching only. And so there's a lot of social emotional learning programs that exist. I know that all boards have them, including ETSB. And I want to nuance and speak to that to a second. And I don't have a problem against building the language of emotion. It is important that we build that language, that emotional literacy. It's important that we give different tools to be able to help students work through their emotions. But there's a difference between accompanying them and teaching it like as if it was a subject area. And so assuming that self-control can be taught intellectually negates the importance of emotional experience, especially those vulnerable feelings, to help maturation along. Focusing on self-regulation prematurely can endanger the very process by which it is achieved, because if the student feels ashamed or feels guilty, then those defenses will numb out the vulnerable emotions needed for that emotional health and growth. And if we focus on calming down prematurely, again, it disregards the more fundamental need of expressing and building a healthy relationship with one's emotions. And so, unfortunately, what we're doing when we're trying to teach all of these things prematurely is we're giving the message to the student that their emotions and behavior are acceptable only within those parameters, and that only certain emotions are invited and welcome, and that those other emotions are inappropriate and should not be. And I'm not saying that that's what we're doing explicitly, but we indirectly, that's the message that we're giving when we're focusing on intention, we're focusing on reasoning, we're focusing on cutting out the emotions to be able to come back to a state of calm too quickly. This is what the message that we're giving. Gordon Neufeld has a 5-hour course on the science of emotion. I'm really not giving it justice at this point. And so even the slide, there's so much information that comes here. I'm just going to oversee it quickly, but understanding that the approaches that focus on reflecting and self-regulation first are actually going at the process backwards. In order to let emotions be healthy and mature, the first step in is to allow for emotions to express themselves. Then it's to build the emotional literacy. It is also needed for the student to be vulnerable enough that they feel their emotions. How often we've got students, especially neurodivergent populations and complex trauma students, that they have emotions, but they're not recognizing those emotions and not feeling those emotions. And until you can feel those emotions, you cannot regulate them or reflect on them. There needs to be a consciousness about what is happening to your body. And so our role as school staff is to help work through the first two, giving space for expression in different ways, building that emotional literacy, setting up through safe places and our safe relationship in co-regulation, enough vulnerability that they will remain soft and not defended. And then we can focus on regulation and reflection. So before we get to self-regulation, starts co-regulation. And of course, if we're going to be doing co-regulation, we also need to choose our timing. And so it's about knowing where the child is at in the stress curve. And so if the child is or student is at a place of high anxiety and panic, it's not the time to be talking to them and to try to validate. They're not hearing us. At that time is really to focus on de-escalation if they're dysregulated, and to have a safe presence, and to be careful with our own levels of stress, that if we are there too, that we have another adult step in if needed, or that we are become conscious enough that we take a step back. We need to not move into the student to dysregulate them further. We need to back off. We need to give them space. Think about your CPI and your BMS training. I don't know which one of the two you have, but when you are faced with a crisis type intervention, what these trainings tell you is to focus on de-escalation first. And they talk about taking a step back, giving space, not being in their bubble, being careful about not talking too much, being careful about your tone, being careful about your nonverbal communication, and so forth. And so all of that is so important in those moments. So now we're at the fourth and last section of this presentation. We are going to look at neurodiversity affirming practices and and trauma-informed practices. So when we're talking about neurodiversity affirming language and practices, rather than focusing on high or low functioning and describing the student's challenge in that way, that we describe the student in their level of need and support. So looking at the levels of support from level 1 requiring some support, level 2 requiring further support, and level 3 requiring intensive support. And this fits in, by the way, with the CBM pyramid of intervention. I have that on the website. I'm going to show that to you, but going from best practices to for all, to targeted practices to some, to more intensified individualized practices to few. And I've got a pyramid for elementary, I've got one for high school, and I've got one now that I've worked on recently for K4, K5. So functionality labels limit the perception of the student in question and distorts the reality of the individual being described. So it's not whether they are high functioning or low functioning, it's about what support do they need in order to be successful. And this is more positive supportive language. It is more about accurate, ethical, and useful to describe strength and challenges, as well as the level of support, rather than focusing on high and low functioning. And so the language and practices we choose have an impact on how people view and treat neurological differences as well. Instead of red flags and deficits, try traits or individual differences. Neurodivergence is not a problem to be solved, but a different way of being, which needs to be honored. Language matters. Using the terms red flag and deficit invoke fear, negativity, and unacceptance, whereas the words traits and individual differences, they are more neutral in their description. And so saying something like Sarah is non-speaking and she uses a device to communicate, or saying something like Johnny expresses joy by hand flapping, would be a way of doing it using neurodiverse affirming language. Instead of using the word obsession, try special interest or deep interest as a language. The term obsession carries a negative connotation and insinuates that the interests of that particular individual are problematic. In reality, deep interest can be a beautiful strength, as well as being extremely meaningful and rewarding. Jordan has a strong visual special skill, or Katie tells great stories about her favorite character. And so again, being careful about the way we use language. And so in terms of the pyramid of intervention, the foundation, the reason for this pyramid is all about prevention first. And so understanding that students typically don't respond well in crisis intervention situations, and it is quite difficult to make headway in those circumstances because they're indisposed in that moment, they're not receptive under stress, and they're not accessible when disengaged and disconnected to the adult who's trying to intervene. And so it's not the time or place to try a new strategy. It's not when they're upset. We need to try to build in systematically, schedule it in, assigning it to the student in the preventative mode. A student's success depends on their sense of safety, building that attachment with the adult, the structures, the routines, the predictability. This is still important in high school, not just in elementary. Introducing those tools and supports and in a time where the student is calm and receptive. And so this will help for them to explore those tools, practice those tools, and see if they work or not for them. And please understand that growth only happens in moments of rest. So the more that we put in place prevention strategies, the more that we'll find pockets of time where the student can be at rest, the more they will grow, and the less there will become crisis situations to intervene in. And so it's about adapting to the student's specific needs and challenges and understanding for that student what's happening underneath the iceberg. What emotions at play? Is there trauma that's in that student's life? Is the child neurodivergent? What about their defenses? What about their attachment? Are they immature? All of that needs to be taken into consideration when we're trying to apply a specific strategy to support that behavior. Now, understand also what's at the root of behavior. How does behavior change? And so when we understand the nature of emotions and the root of behavior, we find out that behavior only changes when the brain and body is feeling safe. And so trying to establish moments of safety through the sensory and the stress response, especially with our complex trauma and neurodivergent cases. Behavior only changes when the student is feeling connected in a nurturing relationship with an adult. Because if they're not attached to that adult, or they're just disengaged, then they're not feeling safe, and that's not contributing to helping them be more successful. Behavior only changes when emotions are felt and that defenses are softened. And the last one is behavior only changes when the brain has matured enough to make way for those processes, and the fruit of those processes are the mature behavior. Now, I didn't put it in this PowerPoint, but I've got a slide that talks about what does it mean to be mature? What are those processes for an individual to be mature and that lead to those fruit? There's 3 processes that lead to maturation. The emergent process, which is about becoming your own person. There is the adaptive process, which is about being able to bounce back from a difficult situation, or to be able to shift the way that we do things when things don't work and so forth. And so this is the second. And the third is the integrative process, which is what I was talking about the mixing of emotions, having perspective of 2 things that come together and that neutralize each other. And so the fruit of those 3 processes is for the individual to be independent and to be resourceful. The second one is the individual who is able to be resourceful and resilient to bounce back. The third one is the individual to be able to regulate their emotions and not be so impulsive. And so all of these attributes are not things that we can teach intellectually. These are fruits that grow if the conditions are in place to allow for maturation to unfold through these 3 processes. And so when we understand that, and that the student is faced with a struggling situation, it's not about trying to control the student's behavior. It's about managing the circumstances to help them be more successful. And so I love this quote. And we're so much more intuitive when it comes to gardening, that when a flower doesn't bloom, we fix the environment in which it grows, not the flower itself. And so applying that analogy to students, that trying to set up the conditions of safety, of attachment, of emotion, and making room for play, especially for those students that have high numbness and defendedness, they won't attach easily. They won't be in touch easily with their emotions. And so to be able to do this in the play mode, we're able to cut out the true repercussions of life, and they're able to practice and try different things without repercussions because it's in the play mode. And so these are so fundamental in order to help the student have the right conditions to grow. Now, the other thing that's really important for me to mention is the importance of the power of teamwork. And so it's not meant to be one adult who takes care of the student, whether the teacher, whether the support staff. It is about working at it together as a team, that we share the responsibility of that student, especially those tier 3, high explosive, complex cases. Sharing the responsibility, sharing the weight of that student, that we have different spaces where the student can go if they're not functioning in the classroom, whether it's that another teacher has offered what we call a foster class. This information is available on the CBM website, or that you have in your school a nurturing support center. I've got many of your schools at ETSB that are starting to put in place nurturing support centers, both at the elementary and at the high school. And so those could be a place where the student can go to be able to take a break and to work on things outside of the classroom. Communication is so important, that all of the members, part of the team who's involved with that student, are in the know of what works for the student, what doesn't work for the student, and if things have changed in their plan of action. And of course, receiving the collaboration and support, not just within the school walls, but also from the school board personnel and outside services if needed. So in terms of the pyramid of intervention, looking at from the universal best practices, tier 1 practices, applying all of those to all students in the classroom, daily practices that are led by the teacher, focused on prevention, looking at setting up the room, the physical setup of the room, and the social environment, the way that who's sitting with who, the lighting in the room, and so forth. There's many different things to keep in mind in terms of being sensitive and inclusive to neurodivergent and trauma and complex trauma students. Because oftentimes, if you have a room that's too cluttered, or you have a room that has too much, bright colors or bright lighting, that can be a distraction to those students. Thinking about what are those inclusive practices that are not just that are moving away from neurotypical norms and that don't push those students to mask. Having trauma-informed practices. I offered last year as well a presentation on trauma-informed practices and what those look like. And honestly, they all fit in together. And offering an array of tools and resources to answer to a range of needs and differences. And so going back to the sense of safety, the emotional expression, and building the self-strength through courage, and building that resiliency to bounce back. And so examples, minimizing the sensory input in the space for the student to not overstimulate. So having fewer decorations, less intense colors. I mentioned that already. Also, in terms of having flexibility in the classroom, many students can't stay seated for long periods of time. They need to potentially stand up to work or to have a different type of seat. And so to be able to honor that and to offer that to different students. Providing tools that they may need to help them to focus or to manage sensory overload, and figuring out which tool works best for that particular student, creating that sensory retreat for that student, including a sensory breaks part of the school day, whether in class or out of class, that we provide choice for the sensory input opportunities. If the student on the opposite is hyposensitive and needs extra input, that we set those up. Making sensory activities fun and engaging, helping students to recognize their internal cues when they need a break. And if they can't recognize, can we be that for them? Now, Editopia at the beginning of the school year posted this wonderful editorial on brain breaks for adolescents. We oftentimes hear about brain breaks for elementary. There are some for high school. Yes, teenagers need brain breaks as well, not just elementary level students. And so there are examples of 17 tailored brain breaks for the high school. And so I invite you to go and take a look at these. For tier 2, more targeted practices. And so those are for some students, not all, and we're not yet for the few, where those measures are meant to be assigned or scheduled for the student. And of course, we need to continue with the tier 1. So we're adding tier 2 to tier 1. And so perhaps for that student, we are assigning a flexible seat. Now, keep in mind that for some students, not all seats work for them. You have to try them out and to see, like, is it a yoga ball? Is it a wobble stool? Maybe the wobble stool is more distracting than helpful. And if it doesn't work, let's not stop there. Let's try something else. And so it's important for students to be able to not just to advocate for themselves and to be self-aware of what they need, but that we take the time and that we have the space to be able to try out different things. Offering a quiet corner in the classroom. And yes, this can also be done at high school. Now, we don't need to have 3 walls. It could just be that there's 2 in a corner and that there's a desk there where students can just have, a cocoon place to be able to move away from the outside stimuli. That could be a way for students to be able to focus and to recenter themselves. Some students may need an individual bin to be used in the classroom, that if they are overstimulated with or they need to recenter themselves, or that the activity at hand is just too frustrating for them, that they may take something from their bin to work on to be able to recenter themselves before they go back to the activity at hand. And again, it's not for all students, it's for some students. And then again, in tier 3, we are looking at more intensive and individualized measures. And these are done mostly one-to-one at this point. And again, we are adapting and tailoring those to the student's individual needs and interest. And a student may require an adapted schedule as well. And so rather than trying to impose that they stay in the classroom all day, every day, and that they can't manage, that we try to find pockets of time where they will spend outside of the class. And they're still doing work, it's just that they're doing it not in class. And so it's so important at tier 3 that there's a collaboration, not just between the school's team, but that board consultants or professionals are involved, parents are involved, and outside partners if present. And again, this is an add-on to tier 1 and 2. So one example could be that we schedule multiple check-ins for that student, first thing when they come in the morning, and that we assign a significant adult. It has to be an adult that the student feels comfortable with, and that they get to talk to that student first thing in the morning, see where their head's at, see if they have the materials they need. It could be after lunch, see if they're not dysregulated and what support they may need, and to figure that out. If the student needs to leave the classroom, that we use time away instead of time out, where they will go and see another adult, excuse me. And if no other adult is available, that we use the quiet area in the classroom. But if it is possible, then the student perhaps could go and deliver a book or an envelope. Could be the school secretary, it could be the school technician, it could be any adult really. And if you have a nurturing support center, that would be the space. And always letting the student know that the relationship is still intact no matter what happened, that the behavior is not the bottom line. And so the Nurturing Support Center at the high school, for those who have it, and of course at the elementary, that the student may have a pass to go and visit the space, to go and do some work in a quiet space, or to go and talk to an adult, or if they just need alone time. Maybe they might participate in an interest club during a break or lunch, or that they need to have a more sheltered place because it's just too vulnerable to be in the outside world, in the cafeteria, for example, during lunch, and to orchestrate and schedule for those students. And so those students need support in terms of their feelings and their emotions. I've talked about that at length today, co-regulating with them, validating those emotions, providing those supports that they need, whether it might be visual supports and more. And making it part of everyday life. We all have emotions. It is normal for everybody at time to time to get upset, and that we can even model and share and so forth. And so again, going back to that stress curve, as we're making space for that student and walking that through, that we are detached from, if there is a high crisis situation, that we are detached emotionally from it, that we are more in the observer mode, that we're asking ourselves the question, what is the other person trying to communicate? How can I respond in a way that will be beneficial for that student? What am I trying to express or convey to that student as of the attempts that I'm trying to do, and how is the student responding to me? And so using the analogy of not just having the lens to make sense of that student, but also using the mirror of recognizing where we're at. And so there's different elements that are involved here in a crisis situation. It's not just the context itself, but who's the student that we're dealing with, and the adult response. And so depending on the developmental level of that student, where they're at in terms of their sensitivity, whether there's been some trauma or stressors in their lives, what is the environment in the moment? Are there certain stressors? Maybe there's an audience. How about safety? How about the engagement of the student with the adult? And of course, keeping in mind the adult stress level, and being reflective rather than being reactive, and using nonverbal responses over verbal responses. And so for those hard to reach students, when situations continue to be difficult and challenging, having team meetings to discuss these cases can be helpful in order to decide what intervention to use. It's important to remind the adults that even a small change can be a success for those complex case students, and that it's key that all adults are informed of changes if needed. And I've talked about that before. And so, guiding principles should be, how can we help through our practices keep everyone safe? How can we help this student have a better day? And how can we help this student have hope for their future? And so I mentioned putting together a plan. On my website, I've got different documents that you can use, that you can have with your team as you're discussing. You may have one yourselves at your board. And so looking at how to put together a plan for that student. In terms of having an IEP, if the student has an IEP, again, using neurodiversity affirming language in that IEP, and that there's many different considerations to put in that IEP. I'm going to send with the PowerPoint another document with a list of accommodations to think about for neurodiverse populations. And so in terms of supporting the student's growth, trying to find that balance between pushing the child enough, but at the same time not pushing them too much that it pushes them over the edge, and protecting them from that overwhelm. That we recognize when the child has reached their limit and being stirred up, and that they're too much pressure and they need to be removed from that pressure. Encouraging the child to try challenging activities, but in small increments in order to be successful. Remember that these children higher cortisol levels for normal stressors than other children. Remember, I said the amygdala kind of kicks off easily. And so we want to help them to tolerate that level of stress so it's not too much. I mentioned that CBM has a website with a lot of different resources. I'm going to stop sharing this PowerPoint so I can just show you quickly the sections where to look on the website. So if I'm just going to open the here we go. I'm going to share a screen again. So, whoops, let me just, what am I doing? No, here. Okay. So if you go to the website cebm.ca, and I'm going to put it in the chat. So this is www.cebm.ca, and I'm going to put it to all. So here's the website, cbm.ca. And when you go to the main website, if you're interested in attending other events that I offer, and I've got recordings of previous events, here is where you would go to register to an event. If you want to watch previous recordings, if you go under library, I've got video recordings, and this is where previous events are available. But in terms of the resources, if you go to Resource Center, it will open a second website. And underneath the theoretical framework, I've got a section dedicated to trauma, and I've got a section dedicated to the sensitive child. I also have something on co-regulation here. Then in terms of challenges, I've got one on neurodivergence, and there's information here. In terms of the practices, you've got the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And so there's examples. I'll just open one to give you an example. So you've got the pyramid of intervention for K4, K5 for elementary and high school. And then you've got, if you open the document, oh, sorry, I should have opened the elementary one. When you open the document, you've got all of the different tiers there. You walk them through, and then we also have considerations to think about. And so all of that, if you look underneath here on the web page, we've got different resources that are available for you to download and use. And so these ones here on the website are elementary, or for elementary. I am working on having a separate section for high school and one for K4, K5. I do right now on my regular website have a section for K4, K5 here, with different videos and supports. And for secondary, I've got two. So here, these are presentations I did last year. The pyramid is here for high school, and I've got some other materials there. So, and then in terms of so those are the practices. And in terms of the materials, I've got a list here of different types of materials available. For example, for emotions, if you want to use, for elementary, I've got the emotions folder. You can download all of the parts to be able to make it, and the squawk box. And so the squawk box is just like one step further, more sophisticated than the emotions folder. I would use the emotions folder with kindergarten and cycle 1, grade 1 potentially. And for more, students who have got more vocabulary, I would be using the squawk box. And I've got one here for high school. And so I invite you to go and take a look at that. So I'm going to stop sharing, stop the recording. Thank you very much, everybody. And we've got some time for questions.